Misha here, and it's been a good long while, I think since the holidays, that I've been able to do a 1/72 scale diecast aircraft video. Been working on the main channel, Mishaco. Well, my actual job. I do these when time permits, and with the cost of models these days, they're getting almost as expensive as guns. But a couple of you have requested, and I will say that if this gets a decent number of views, it will give me inspiration to do more. Not trying to hold it hostage, but these take a lot of time to do, more than you might imagine. But today we get to talk about a new tooling from Hobbymaster, one that was on the docket for almost 2 years. Before, if you wanted a French Dassault Mirage 3, your only options really were old Falcon models. And I did pick this one up new towards the end of their run. And frankly, they were true diecast, solid metal, and they were priced very fair for what they were. But detail is not always the greatest or most accurate. Well, you did get opening and closing canopies. You didn't get pilot figures. Ordnance loads were, and their overall quality control was pretty iffy. I remember the Mirage F1 they didn't have one of the landing gear doors. Not just mine, but all of them. And I don't think they actually had license from Dassault, and they got sued. And, well, they're gone now. Now, we did actually look at a model or two. One that was actually donated by a supporter from the Premier X, which is actually under the Dassault brand name. But Hobbymaster announced they were doing an official copy in the same scale that I collect. And since it took so long to get here, I ended up with not one, not two, but 3 examples. And I'm actually glad I ended up with 3, because that's the number of ordnance loadouts you can do with these. In the middle we have a French Air Force Air Superiority or Combat Air Patrol Intercept version from the 70s. Over here we have a desert camo version from the 80s with the late style missiles, and it's in a close air support role. And finally, and probably most famously, we have an Israeli French-made Mirage 3CJ, their variant, in a late 1960s role, circa 6 Days War, and it's in a ground attack strike configuration with a couple of unique Israeli things. So as always, we're going to go through the history of the Mirage 3 and look at these from Hobbymaster, talk about the options, and finally we get to get the spinny thing out again. It has been a good long while. Before we can talk about the Dassault Mirage 3, let's briefly go back to previous Dassault jets. This is a Mystère 4, and this is one of those Premium X 1/72 scale diecast models that are basically officially licensed and carried by Dassault Aviation today. Now, this isn't the one that Brett gave me last year. That's actually a Mirage 4. I did a video on it, but if you'd like to see a revisit of some or all of the French aircraft, let me know and I can do it. If there's interest, I will. But because I like that model so much and appreciated his donation, I picked up 1 or 2 others to kind of fill in gaps, and this is the only Mystère 4 I've seen in this scale and diecast. Now I've just got sitting on the spinny thing, because the only thing I will say about the Premier X is I do not like their stands. In fact, I took a Hobby Master F4 stand and modified it. It fits surprisingly well. But this is a pretty basic aircraft, quite frankly. And would you believe, after World War II, France did not have much in the way of aviation. In fact, its first jets were de Havilland Vampires and some Venoms ordered from the UK back around 49-50. It would also get some F-84s and F-86s from the USA during the Korean War as part of a mutual aid program. But France was not content to just buy or copy foreign designs. They were already working on their own. Their first domestic jet flew, or at least the military jet, in 49, went into service in 51, but it was pretty limited. This is the Mystère 4, obviously based on the 1, 2, and 3, although I believe only really the 2 went into any kind of real production, and even it pretty small. Now, the 4 here first flew in 1952 and was ordered by the French Air Force, or Army of the Air, in 1953. And it too was kind of done by the U.S. government. It's kind of like how the number 4 Mark I Savage was made in the U.S., marked U.S. property, but it was made for the U.K. The U.S. Air Force actually ordered the Mystère 4. They ordered about 220 originally, but they were to be operated, cared for by the French Air Force, and they would very quickly go into service. Ultimately, 6 squads would have these, and they would serve in the Suez Crisis. They were used as a fighter-bomber. The earlier designs were straight wing. The Mystères were the first swept wing. They were not supersonic, not yet. We're getting there. But they were transonic. So basically, in a dive, it could just skirt Mach speed. So max speed is 680 to 700 miles per hour. It's about 42 feet by 36 feet. Max altitude of about 48,000 to 49,000 feet. And this was a gunfighter. It had 2 30mm Defa cannons with about 150 rounds each, I believe. And these proved to be very good cannons. France had played around with some other guns earlier, but this is what they settled on, and it lasted. It did have underwing hardpoints to carry dumb bombs, rockets, but it could only carry about 1,000 kilos, 2,200 pounds. And I don't know about the drop tank situation. It probably was plumbed for it, but its service, while it served in relatively large numbers, they had over 240 at one time, was pretty brief. It was already being phased out by 1957, 1958 by the Super Mystère. Just very briefly, since it's relevant to this video later on, they had some export customers. India was one. Well, we'll talk about that another day if you want. But Israel actually would order 60 of these plus 1 reconnaissance variant. Originally they were going to get one of the previous Mystère models, but in 55, I believe, they switched over to the 4. And they were just getting these when the Suez Crisis was happening in 56. So actually France and Israel both flew the same jet, primarily using it as a ground attacker, close air support type thing in that October of that year. And Israel would ultimately field, I think, 3 squads of these, including the 101. And they would be in frontline service through the early to mid 60s, even still seeing some service in the 6 Days War, but being retired before the Yom Kippur War. I think they were retired around 70, 71, 72. by that time, you know, attrition. It was a sturdy plane, and it put Dassault on the map as far as a aircraft manufacturer. And really, they were a very small factory at this time. But it's this that led to the Super Mystère in 1957, which itself is the direct predecessor to the Mirage 3. In fact, early testing and prototyping of the Mirage pretty much just had it in the Mystère line, but enough changes and differences that happened that they broke it off into its own thing with the Mirage 1. But yeah, I like these models for what they are. They do kind of remind me of somewhere between a Falcon and a Corgi. They do have gear up or down. Some have ordnance, this one doesn't, but again, it was a gunfighter. But at this time, France is just establishing its manufacturing and design. They would only build about 400 of these. But when you compare that to the Mirage, yeah, it's amazing how far they made it. Since for most of this video we're going to be looking at the new Hobbymaster, while we talk about the background, let's put the old Falcon Mirage 3C on the spinny thing just for a minute. This is still 1/72 scale, as I mentioned, so it is in line with everything else. And you know, for tooling that goes back 20 years and for what these cost, I don't regret it. Anywho, this is the 3. What about 1 and 2? Well, going all the way back to 1952, middle of the Korean War, the French government, the French Air Force, they're doing studies. They're looking at a jet. Like I said, they have a subsonic jet. They're just about to get a transonic and a supersonic, which will end up being the Mystère, or I should say the Super Mystère is years away. But they need an interceptor. A lot of these are fighter bombers. They need something that can go up and knock down enemy bombers, what have you, as well as fly combat air patrol. And basically they outline what they want. They want it to be able to hit Mach 1.3. They want it to be able to get up to about 59,000 feet, carry modern ordnance, yada yada. 3 companies respond. You have Sud-Est, Sud-Ist, and Dassault Aviation. And really at this time, a lot of people are thinking Sud might win. Dassault is still making a name for itself. And their original design had 2 small engines, and it was known as the Model 550 Delta. And that's because they were going to this Delta wing. There are pros and cons to Deltas. For one, they're easy to manufacture, sturdy, reliable, and again, setting up your aviation industry makes sense. They also went to this kind of tailless design, or at least no horizontals, vertical there. But it also has a pretty high landing speed, needs a pretty long runway, and while they are fast in a straight line, Delta wing planes, maneuverability, agility can definitely suffer, especially before the use of canards and things. But this is what they're going with. In the original version, the prototype was pretty lightweight. It takes to the sky in 1954, and while it doesn't hit the Mach 1.3 target, it does go supersonic, if just barely. They think about what to do next, because they're looking at it, this is post-Korean War, new air-to-air missiles are coming in, and they realize it can only really carry 1. And if it were still, you know, a gunfighter's arena, sure, 1 missile with guns, but they're looking to the future. And again, Interceptor, not really going at other fighters, but bombers. So essentially, with the 550 Delta, Dassault takes the lead. This will become the Mirage 1. As I said earlier, there was a bit of overlap with the Mystère line, but this is its own thing, and overtakes it. But the Mirage 1 is too small. It can only carry one modern air-to-air missile, modern standards in 1954, 1955, post-Korean War. And it can still carry the DEFA cannon. They're really liking this 30mm cannon. I don't blame them. But they see the future of things. The first notion is, okay, we'll just scale it up. So they design on paper the Mirage 2. But it never goes into production. Instead, you get the Mirage 3. This is a compromise. We go to one larger engine, and the aircraft is about, a third larger than the Mirage 1. And the first prototype is manufactured in 1956 and takes its first test flight November 17 of that year and does well. Later on, it'll hit the Mach 1.3 target without rocket assist and up to Mach 1.6, but by the standards of 1957, the original requirements have to be updated. They need more, and understandably so. Aircraft technology is so rapidly increasing at this time. So what the French government does, they order 10 pre-production examples, and these would be known as the Mirage 3A. And they would be delivered between 1958 and 1959, and they would fly, eventually hitting Mach 1.8 and then Mach 2.2. And this is important because this is the first production kind of Western jet to exceed Mach 2 in level flight, just military jet. This is when Dassault is really establishing itself and not just pulling ahead of the competition within France, but really challenging the established jet designers, creators, builders in the UK and USA. Here's the Mystère 4 and Mirage 3 together. They are in scale, so it goes to show you this is still a slim and trim aircraft because this one's not huge. It's kind of like the F-100 Super Sabre, a little bit smaller, but either way. The pre-production batch goes quite well and leads to the full production version known as the Mirage 3C. It first flies in 1960. It's a little bit longer, it has full kit. The original pre-production craft didn't have all the avionics installed. And then July of 1961, the first true production Mirage is handed over to the French Air Force. And I should point out, the earliest ones just had 3 hardpoints, 1 center line, 1 on each wing. This would very quickly be updated to 5. Actually mirroring the MiG-21, which this aircraft is so close to in a lot of ways and would go up against in combat more than once. And they both kind of cross that boundary of Generation 2 to Generation 3 jet fighters. And with that, now we can talk about the Hobbymaster and French service. As with our Falcon, our first Hobbymaster, although I think it actually might be the most recent release, the 03, is in the Air Intercept rapid response, although combat air patrol role paint scheme as well, 1970s. And the Mirage 3, including all the variants, was said to be the backbone of the French Air Force during the 1960s and 70s, and definitely into the 80s, but by that time there were newer jets coming around. So what about its specs here? Again, this one's just in its standard as they come, which is a good thing. The 3C was an air intercept plane. It had limited fighting capability and very limited fighter bomber capability, although it would be expanded upon as time would go on. Now, like other Delta wings of the late 50s, early 60s, like the Convair F-102 or even the original MiG-21, it was a short-range, high-speed, zoom up to altitude, hit a bomber type thing. And it was designed to be an all-weather. Specs. It's actually a little bit longer than the Mystere at about 49 feet, but it's much more narrow at about 27 feet. It has the wasp waist design, again, like we see in the Convair and some others. It was definitely fast enough, capable of Mach 2 up to 2.2. It didn't quite hit the 59,000 max altitude they wanted. Then again, it had a heavier payload than they originally planned for, and its max altitude is about 55 to 56,000 feet. Yeah, good enough. Range, not all that great, even though the Delta design does give reasonable internal tankage. Good news is it was actually plumbed 3 out of the 5 hard points for tanks. Some were drop tanks, but a lot of them were actually just, fixed supersonic tanks, like on here. And since it was an all-weather, it was fitted with a radar. But the radar was very much designed for the purpose of intercepting. The Cyrano 1 originally was just a ranging radar. They would update it with a later version, which did give some limited guidance capabilities for semi-guided, semi-autonomous missiles. We'll get there. But the idea was it was meant to detect objects up and at high altitude, and it did okay there for the day and time. It had virtually no look down and no shoot down capability. It had no low level terrain following guidance systems built in, no electronic countermeasures. For the day and time, what could you do with it? That's just kind of how things were. It was designed for a purpose. Of course, it was a single seat. By this point, a single engine. Has an interesting exhaust in the back here. I've heard it called like an eyelid where it opens and closes. I should also mention, since we are talking about the Hobby Masters too, I'm pretty happy they're coming with the new style of stand now. I could think of a few improvements I'd do to it, like a weighted base, but for lighter models like this one, even though it is pretty much all die-cast, it's okay. And even heavier ones like the MiG 25 and 31 seem to do fine on it, but I still feel like it could use a little bit more reinforcement. Oh well, anyway, at least the base is quite wide. And the model, it does come with gear up and down, canopy open or closed, pilot figure who, he's cramped in there, he barely has legs. The Mirage has quite the tight cockpit. No air refueling, at least not on this version. And like I said, the earliest ones did have 3 hard points, but very quickly we have 5, and that seems to be the standard. So let's look at its loadout here. And we'll just take it off the stand. It just plugs into the engine, not too tight, which is actually good. When they're really tight, they tend to pull out a lot of the engine detail. The only bad thing without having a tail back here to grab it by, I usually feel like I want 2 hands just to be safe. Then I mentioned die-cast models are getting very spendy. Alright, the premier weapon is one single Matra R530 missile. It's on the center line there. That's the only place it can hold it. It can only hold 1. This is kind of like an AIM 7, like a Sparrow, or British equivalent a little earlier on. So you're looking at, 2 to 6 kilometer range, early guidance. Some were heat seeking, some were radar guided homing. Kind of depends on the loadout. And that was made in France. On the outboard stations, as far as I know, they can only carry a lightweight, short-range visual air-to-air missile. And a little interestingly, the French Mirage 3 carried the AIM-9B Sidewinder. Now you might think, well, they might get a license to produce it or make their own variant. Israel would do that. But best I know, France actually just obtained Sidewinders from the USA. And I think we all know about it. Obviously, when these were introduced in 61, 62, 63, the Sidewinder was still maturing, but was a lot better than it had been just even a few years earlier. And then finally we have tanks. And that's actually very important because without external fuel, the range, the endurance of this plane was pretty limited. There and again, for defense, like they were used in France, bomber defense, you didn't need long range, great endurance. The original tanks were 500 liter. They would soon update to a 625 liter version. Very long, very skinny. They would also have a 1300 liter version. Those are typically carried on the center line only, so if you had that, you couldn't have your Matra missile there. And for ferry flights, subsonic, just getting places, they did have a 1700 liter tank, and you could carry up to 2 of those, but that was all it could do. They weren't for combat. It could theoretically carry 3 tanks, but if it did that, that's about all it could lift, because total stores on paper 4,000 kilograms, so 8,800 pounds. But again, if you load it up to the max, there are sacrifices. And keep in mind, because it is a delta wing, it needs a pretty long runway, and it has a pretty high landing speed, and the gear, well, they don't exactly put it up really high. It's one reason, amongst others, that you can't really put one of the 530s under the wings. Chances are it would scrape the ground. But maybe most importantly, early on, unlike the F4 Phantom, this still had a cannon. In fact, it had 2 of them. Right here, under the intakes, built in, we have 2, 1 per side, 30mm Defa cannons with 125 rounds each. And early on, that's what pilots, especially export customers, would use, because they weren't expecting Soviet bombers. They had other needs and capabilities. But as missiles matured, and this would get updated missiles itself. In fact, I believe the original missile this was built for was actually the R511. But really, when this came into service, the 530 was becoming available. So there we go. That's our loadout and capabilities. As I said, they started to acquire these halfway through 1961, and in total of this single-seat version that was combat capable as an interceptor, the French Air Force would receive 95. A short time later, they would start receiving the 2-seat training transitional version known as the Mirage 3B. It was not classed as being combat capable. It lacked the radar, and it was a little bit longer to make room for the second seat. It lacked the cannon, and I believe it might have lacked a little bit of extra fuel tankage or something too. Anyway, it was for training, keeping things going. and they would get 60 standard 3Bs plus 3 pre-production or prototype versions. They would come a very short time later and actually stay in service as long as any of them. I should also mention the rocket motor down here. Like I said, this was designed to zoom up and hit a high target with little warning, you know. So under the main engine, there was a mount and a place for the Interceptor rocket motor, and they did put them in production, but because the fuel was difficult and even deadly to use and just a pain in the neck, and luckily the Cold War never went hot, in reality it was deployed very little, but it could zoom up fast and high with it, and it was a feature on the Mirage 3C, so I thought I'd better mention it, although certain export models like the Israeli did not feature it. Really neat aircraft. Again, it gave a lot of other planes a run for their money. It was less expensive than, say, Western options. It was dependable, yet it still had arguably better capabilities, or at least equal capabilities to the COM block, the Warsaw Pack, like the MiG-19, MiG-21. And the two would kind of keep pace for quite some time. But no, it was quite a success for Dassault. And in the air intercept and combat patrol roles, it would be in frontline service through the 70s, and even still be there through the 1980s, although by that time, you know, times were a-changin'. But I really do like this just kind of basic version. Glad the model's quite nice too, because we waited long enough for it. But speaking of, let's talk about some of its derivations and whatnot, because this thing was put into many roles within the French Air Force, not just interceptor, but tactical fighter, even fighter bomber, even nuclear strike aircraft, and advanced reconnaissance aircraft. How could the 3C do all that? Well, it couldn't. Next, we move to the second Hobbymaster Mirage 3 release in a desert camo scheme. Specifically, this is from Djibouti, and a deployment that France had there. That nation was actually independent in 1977, but they had an agreement with the French government where France could operate military bases there, and that was to kind of give control of the region, parts of Africa, the Indian Ocean, you know, protect French interests as they were perceived. And so this one is from 1984, probably one of the last times the Mirage 3 would be deployed overseas. And I do have it set up in a kind of close air support or patrol and light strike role here. But the 3C wasn't really good at that. Luckily, as it was going into full production in 1961, an updated version, meant to be a strike aircraft, tactical fighter, fighter bomber, was being tested. And it was adopted, and the first ones received by the French Air Force in 1964 as the Mirage 3E. And if you're wondering about the D, simple, that was the two-seat training version of the E. It's essentially the same plane, slightly longer airframe, and that is to make room for a little bit more fuel tankage, but also a new radar sensor suite that it gives some limited ground targeting capability. Nothing like lasers, just, you know, early terrain following, terrain mapping. It gives them some ability, and its air-to-air ability as an interceptor stayed the same or even decreased. Its air abilities as a fighter stayed about the same. In fact, maybe a little better. Hard to say. On the 3C, if you wanted to hit a ground target, well, you were using your gun sight. That's all you had. At least the 3E gave you a little more. It also had a reinforced centerline pylon because, in addition to France using them in its tactical fighter squadrons, they were used in the nuclear deterrence early alert squadrons. In fact, they would stay around until the Mirage 2000N would come around. And they would carry, again we're talking about the 3E, they would carry the AN-52 tactical nuclear weapon. It was about a 500 kg bomb. Yields online are a little crazy. Some say 15 up to 25, even 70. It's not a good day if you get hit by a nuke. Either way, and it would carry about the same stores underbelly that the 3C could, yet it just had a better ability to deliver them safely. And it didn't lose its air-to-air either. So let's look at how I have this one configured. Here you go, look up its tailpipe. Like I said, the engine exhaust would open and close. Now, again, this one's a 3C. If Hobby Master actually makes any, that'd be cool. But for now, this will work. On the center line this time, I have one fuel tank. And on the inner pylons where the tanks could be, I have some Matra Sneb 68mm rocket pods that hold 18, some sources say 19 rockets each. Some of these pods also had a small fuel tank built in as well, and a few different versions were used. And again, for light strikes, they could also carry 250 kilogram bombs there. You could also put a 500 kg bomb on the center line, although I don't think that was done very frequently. And that's really about it, rockets and iron bombs. But another interesting thing about this release, and I'm glad I picked it up, the missiles on the sides. They're not sidewinders. This is actually a domestic missile, the R550 Magic 1. France worked on this in the early 70s, introduced it in 75, and started fitting it to their aircraft shortly thereafter. And by the late 70s, it made its way to the Mirage series, like the 3s, I mean. It was also, of course, on the F1. And it's basically like an AIM 9L. Just better seeker warhead, more reliable, longer range, what have you. Like I said, the original 3Cs had a pretty limited radar for that, but by this point it was updated. And it seems like only the last few years of deployment of the 3 would get the Magic 1 missile. It's really neat though. I actually like the load out of this model. You almost always had to have some external fuel tank if you had any kind of air patrol or support role out of these. I'm curious though, which paint scheme do you like better? The kind of air defense blue or desert color? Let me know, because I definitely don't have an opinion. Here are all 3 Mirage 3s together so far, including the Falcon. They would pick up quite a large number of the 3E for both the fighter role and the nuclear deterrence role, about 192 of them. I do not know if that number counts any D trainers or not though. There would also be a photo reconnaissance variant, the 3R, which replaced the radar in the nose with a camera system, meaning it had no radar. although it did still have the EASE early terrain following mapping systems, so inertial guidance, so that helped. And they'd get 50 of those, and then they would get 20 or so beginning around 1970 of the improved 3RD, which gave it a Doppler radar system, but it was mounted in a bulge or fairing on the belly. So 70 photo reconnaissance. They would retain fighting capability and would stay in service for a good long while. After deployment in Djibouti, the 3Cs would soon be retired out around 1988. They were being replaced by the F1, which had been in service for quite some time, and the upcoming new Mirage 2000. The 3E would actually stay in service till after the Gulf War, being retired around 1994, again in favor of the F1, also the Jaguar, and then the last version to be retired, starting with the older ones, would be the photo reconnaissance. They would slowly phase those out throughout the 90s. I believe the last ones were retired out around 2000. And once they did that, they were able to retire the two-seat trainers because they were no longer needed. It's a testament to the durability, the simple construction, that they were able to stay in service, because these planes were all built in the 60s and early 70s, as far as I know. Of course, they were refurbished and reworked, but I don't believe the French Air Force was buying new ones. Speaking of, total seems to be around 430 planes that served. Now, of those, not all were combat. Obviously, you had the 60 some odd trainers, and you had the reconnaissance planes. You can count those as combat if you like. So realistically, 300 to 350 were actually combat planes. And of course, some were just attrition losses and all that. They would step down from the nuclear deterrent role in favor of the Mirage 2000N around 1990, 1991 as well. But that's not all that Dassault made. No. They made over 1,400 Mirage 3s. And so the majority of these planes actually went to foreign customers, export customers. And so far in the Hobbymaster line, we have this representative. But there were others. And we end with the first Hobbymaster release from the Israeli Air Force. This is technically a variant, the Mirage 3CJ. Does J stand for Jewish? Some sources say yes. It was the designation that Dassault gave. And in the 50s and 60s, France was Israel's major supporter. Times change. And if you'd like to really deep dive into the Israeli Air Force from a historical point of view, I'm willing to do that, keeping modern day stuff to a minimum, because this is about history. But I'm just going to kind of go over this a little bit in this video so we can wrap this up. Like I said, the Israelis have been flying French jets, including the Mystère 4 we began with. And in 1959, they'd already seen the new Mirage 3. In fact, Dassault had invited them. Since Dassault was a private company, they could sell to whoever they wanted within, reason. And so the Israelis wanted one, but they didn't want an Interceptor. They wanted a tactical fighter, air superiority. They were really starting to worry about the new MiG-21, not to mention the MiG-19 is still very much cutting edge at this time too. So they placed an order in 1959 for 24 of these guys. But they don't need that the Sapphire rocket boosted engine. Take it out. In its place, where the mounting would go, let's get some extra fuel. And that got them about 380 extra liters of go juice. And they were always needing this for, the ranges that they were at and missions they were on, be it patrol, strike, air defense, cover, whatever. And they were, from the beginning, planning to use these for a ground attack, something that at that time France had not done yet. And there are a few other updates. Keep in mind, still no aerial refueling for the Mirage 3. And they would soon increase their order to over 70. Most would be the single-seat version, although they did get a few trainers, two-seaters. The first ones were received in April of 1962, and the 101 Squadron, which had been flying Mystere 4s, was able to trade those in, go to these, and as more and more jets were made available, the second squadron stood up that summer, and then in 1964, a third squadron of Mirage 3 CJs was ready. And after they got the single-seaters more or less delivered, they delivered about half a dozen 3B trainers around 1966. And they gave Israel one 3R reconnaissance version. Is more or less a pattern aircraft. Israel would actually convert a handful of their standard jets to reconnaissance birds by just swapping out the nose. By this point, they're really starting to develop their own domestic aviation industry themselves. And that kind of gets to the loadout and, what we've got here. But first, let's talk about the history, because Israel was maybe the first to put these in combat, certainly heavy combat. It wasn't long at all before these would engage in combat. In August of 1963, a flight of Israeli Mirage 3Cs would engage a flight of Syrian MiG-17s, I believe. And while 117 was damaged, it wasn't down, so made it back to base. There you go. It has to be pointed out that while Israel was struggling against Egypt with the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, by this point, Syria is kind of who they're having a hot and cold war with. So the first year, yeah, it's used in its air-to-air role. But in 1964, that November, as things were heating up, first they would use these on the Golan Heights against Syrian artillery targets there in their strike role. And then shortly thereafter, the Mirage would, do what it was meant to do, engage the MiG-21. Even though they were both, weapons hot in the air, there was no casualties on either side. And for this plane, 65 would be pretty calm. But this model here is from July of 66, which is the Mirage 3's first confirmed kill. That was of a MiG-21, and it actually downed it with its cannon. And that's because the early air-to-air missiles the Israelis were using weren't that good. And with that, let's look at the payload. For what it's worth, the Israeli name, even designation for this plane, was the Shahak or Shahak, which means heavens or sky. They usually gave their aircraft their own names, especially considering they were unique variants. And while it was wired and could fire the American AIM-9B Sidewinder, beginning in 1963, most of them flew with the Shafir 1 short-range air-to-air missile. Pretty much looks like an AIM-9B copy. It wasn't great. But then again, the early Sidewinders weren't great either. Just, limited range, not the best seeker head. It would take time. Nevertheless, in the end of 1966, the first missile shoot-down from one of these was recorded, and it was of a MiG-19. Now, I don't know if it had an American Sidewinder or a Shafir, whatever. You know what I mean. One on here, I can tell you that they introduced a much improved version, the Shafir 2, in 1969, and it would get its own kill against an Egyptian target very soon after. So improvements were being made. That's in the air-to-air world, though. On the center line here, we have a couple of bombs. And they would use these. Typically, they would use either a couple of 250 kg bombs to like crater runways, or maybe one 500 kg bomb if it was a really hard target. Although for this aircraft, considering its lack of guidance, I think the 250 was more common, but I could be wrong. And if a anti-armor or light target was required, they would use the Matra 68mm rocket pods as an alternative. I should mention, I don't know if Israel did this, but France did not mix them. If you had bombs, that was it. If you had rockets, that was it for the Mirage 3. I don't believe, because you need fuel tanks somewhere, and since you can't use the outer stations for fuel, they're either going to be the two inner wings or the center line. And if you want to carry something heavy, it needs to be on the center line. And these have different tanks here, because while Israel did have some of the 625 liter tanks, and they did actually take some of the 1300 liter tanks and modify them to fit under the wings. Typically they were carried on the belly. They also made their own or adapted their own, including a unique Israeli 600 liter tank, stubbier and wider. And they even had a Israeli 820 liter tank that was belly mounted. They pretty much, for range, endurance, used whatever they could. And as I said earlier, they still had the 30mm cannon that Israeli pilots used to very good effect, especially early on, but really throughout the IIICJ's service, especially with the 101st here. While newer aircraft were coming around in 1967, before and during the so-called Six-Day War, this was very much in frontline Israeli service. There were 3 full squadrons operating, 50 some odd aircraft available. There you go. They would be in engagements leading up to that war, and right as it was kicking off, actually they were assigned to a strike mission, but then they would have their mission plan changed that time, that day, that moment basically, to air intercept and patrol, and a lot of times they'd also be sent out to kind of protect other aircraft like, say, A-4 Skyhawks. This is still when Israeli forces were being supported by the French, although it wouldn't last long. The French did not like how the Six-Day War went, and it would soon withdraw support, and this is where Israel would shift over to American assistance, and you'll see things like the F-4 Phantom and eventually F-15 and so on and so forth. So that's why you see kind of a big change late 60s, 70s. Of course, then there was that whole Mirage 5 debacle that we're not going to go into today, and unlicensed copies. But they still were flying them in both roles through 1968, but by that time they had better ground attack aircraft, so being around 69 till its retirement, the Mirage 3 was used for air-to-air missions, patrol, reconnaissance, that kind of thing. And while they were starting to age, they were still being used during the Yom Kippur War. They had about 40 available when that war kicked off. But it wasn't long after. They only had about 24 flight-worthy aircraft. Some had been lost. Some had been scavenged for parts to keep others flying because now France is cutting them off. Some were just worn out. These were flying a lot of missions over a lot of years. Again, first against Syria, then against Egypt and other Arab nations. It's a whole thing. Now, of course, Egypt would first kind of break out of the peace that had been established in 69 and then decide, hey, this isn't a great deal, and then back out of the Yom Kippur War. And that would actually lead to a big changeover in Egypt themselves to becoming a Western ally. And it's a whole thing. Nothing's simple about Middle East politics. If anyone says it's simple, they don't know what they're talking about. Anywho, they were still available after the Yom Kippur War. In fact, they were made ready in 1982 as tensions were ratcheting back up, but they never flew in combat by that time, which is good because they just didn't have that many left. And they had much better aircraft. So, effectively, I don't recall off the top of my head exactly when Israel retired these, but, mid-80s, late 80s at the least, and most were either scrapped or sold off. And they kept this one plane for their museum because it flew a lot of missions, had the first confirmed kill, and the Mirage 3 did very well in Israeli service. It was credited with 106 aircraft being downed, and only 5 were combat losses in that sense. Air-to-air losses, I should say. You get a little qualifying there when you want to massage statistics, but their kill-to-loss ratio was definitely favorable to them. And that did really well for Dassault. They could point to their aircraft being used in a combat theater, and with the introduction of the 3E, it would become the most popular version exported by the early 70s, and there'd be other foreign purchasers. For example, Switzerland, they would have their own version. South Africa would put the Mirage to great use. Australia would fly them for quite some time. And maybe most famously, just because they were in the conflict in the Falklands, Argentina. And that's just to name a few. But since we don't have examples from Hobby Master, and I've been talking long enough, we'll end it there. But we can definitely dive into more French Air Force or Israeli Air Force if you like. Just let me know in the comments. And let me know what you think about the new Hobby Master tooling versus the old Falcon. To me, it's very clear the Hobby Master has a lot more detailing, a lot more ordnance options. These actually all come with the missiles, the 2 different types of tanks, 2 different types of, they have a bomb and rocket pods, gear up or down. Of course, you can also display them clean. With this new stand, you don't have the hole in the bottom for a stand. And of course, you can do pilot in or out. And there's just details missing on the Falcon. But again, this was a much cheaper aircraft compared to the Hobby Master, and it's not just economy. So I think for a representative piece, it's fine. It really is. But let me know. And like I said, which scheme do you like better? The Israeli, the French air defense, or the French desert camo? I think the next one they're going to do, number 4, is another Israeli from 1970. I think it's still a 101 squadron, though. So I probably won't pick it up. But if they do an E, which I assume they will, and that would lead to a reconnaissance version, I'd definitely be there for those. But let me know what you think. Do you like French aircraft? I find them very alluring, very appealing. They go really well alongside the other Delta Wing aircraft. Very 1950s, 1960s design. And this is really the edge of the second generation of jet aircraft. I don't think I'd argue it's a third, although you could with the updated radar and the Magic 1 missile. Maybe. But I think we'd save that honor for the F1. But, let me know in the comments what you think. And again, if you'd like me to do more aircraft videos, do comment, do like, do share, do tell your friends. I don't need a ton of views, but this took me 2 days to record this video. So, I like doing them, but it's a matter of time and efficiency, guys. With that, appreciate any help you can give. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.